When we talk about a prison, a jail, we are always struck by this feeling of violence, of danger of death, of all kinds of horrible things, of a deep sadness. Now imagine that on top of that you add isolation, violence by the authority that controls the place, violence from the inmates themselves, the lack of food, the suffocating heat, a brutal solar intensity due to its closeness to the equator, the lack of water. Then we are at the entrance to hell itself, or else we are on the penitentiary island of San Lucas in Costa Rica. Let us begin. This image that I am projecting to you right now has a story. Every time some tourist dressed in shorts, sandals, lots of tanning oil or sunscreen, and a strange look comes near, one of the guides brings up the legend of the bikini girl. The legend says that one fine day the inmates, thirsty for passion, thirsty for impulses of a sexual nature, managed to distract the guards, take control of the infirmary, and kidnap the only nurse there was, with whom they did horrors, unspeakable abuses, extreme violence. When, satisfied in their lowest instincts, they concluded that assault, they murdered the nurse after mutilating her horribly, they used the blood to paint this image. Of course, more than one tourist feels ashamed to have seen that, and there are even some who feel unwell and have to leave the place. However, the story is not entirely true, and it is not entirely true, not because the inmates would not have done it. Of course they would. If there had been a woman there, they surely would have murdered her in the most terrible ways you can imagine. Do not doubt it, that they killed anyone who came near. Yes. Also, that it was painted with blood? No. Tests carried out in recent years show that there is no blood. The compounds with which this image was painted are basically a bit of enamel paint, probably the same used for maintenance, some black paint, and a bit of charcoal very similar to the other image that is around there, the lady with the umbrella, which also represents a life-size woman of voluptuous appearance. These images are nothing but the reflection of a life in captivity in barbaric isolation. They are part of the tour that is made today to San Lucas Island, currently declared a protected sanctuary for nature. The prison, the old prison, is visited by tourists. For some, it is in very bad taste. This is not about going to visit the beach or going to visit a museum. It is a place where death was the everyday, where extreme violence was the everyday, where abuses of a sexual, physical, mental nature were the everyday, where the lack even of the most basic things was also everyday, where death could come from all sides and in the most varied ways. It is not a place where a girl with a little outfit should appear and take a selfie. Nor is it the place that calls for some idiot in espadrille shorts that look like a tent, a stupid smile striking erotic poses next to one of these drawings that represented in the best of cases the erotic longings of an inmate who probably died there. In the worst of cases, these images that are now used as a selfie background represent the hatred that an inmate felt toward a woman, the purest animal desire that another felt toward a woman. There are breathtaking images in there. Some of them are extremely explicit, impossible to put in a video. Others represent messages of repentance, of guilt, of death. Some of them are small fragments that feel poetic, others are dramatic. It is not a place where it feels correct that people go to take selfies. Not because it is a holy place, not because it is a sacred place, but quite the opposite. This was a place where the worst of the human being came to the surface or else died. Let me tell you something more. San Lucas Island was originally called by the natives of the region Shara. Shara was just any island. It had a small community some 3,000 years ago. It was not a place of sacrifices, far from it. It was simply a place where there was fishing activity, where there was gathering, etc. There was a huge population of birds of all kinds. It is located in the Gulf of Nicoya in Costa Rica, on the Pacific Ocean side, near the mouth of the Gulf toward the Pacific. It is a peculiar site for several reasons. First, because it is relatively close to land. To the mainland territory it is 1 kilometer. From the island to land there is 1 kilometer. On the other side, toward the Punta Arenas region, there are some 7 or 8 kilometers. The place as such is not very big. It must be some 400-something hectares, very densely covered with vegetation, with very high temperatures all year round, and yet it is a somewhat dry place. Despite being covered with vegetation, there are no easy outcrops of fresh water. The water found on this island is obviously affected by the constant presence of salt water. The shore, even though it is close, is at the same time very treacherous. The island is surrounded by strong currents, some of them ascending northward, others southward, which connect to the Pacific Ocean, and these strong currents are generated that can carry anything away. But in addition to this, also in the region near the coast, the mainland territory, there are all kinds of things, from caimans, large populations of caimans, venomous animals ranging from snakes, insects, plants, and of course in the crossing from the island to the mainland there is also a large population of sharks. That is to say that this small islet, this island, is a site surrounded by many dangers. But besides this, it is a place that does not seem very suitable for life, even with all this vegetation, even with all this abundant fauna. Let me tell you that in this place there were everything from turtles, deer, good fishing, birds. However, it is not suitable for other reasons. First, the lack of water, of 100% fresh water. Second, the terrible heat, and then, when the rainy season comes in, the impact of winds, storm surges, all that. Perhaps for this reason it was that in 1873 it was considered the suitable place to found a penitentiary island. The place had been used years earlier as a quarantine place. When a ship approached Punta Arenas and there were sick people on board, the ship was sent to the bay of San Lucas Island, a site somewhat protected from the currents and where it could anchor and stay there as long as necessary. When the crew had died, those who had to die, and those who survived, well, the ship could continue on its way. So it already had some precedent that at least the bay was a place where bodies were thrown. For that year of 1873, the then Costa Rican ruler Tomás Guardia decided to convert it along with Cocos Island, or El Coco, into penitentiary communities, into penitentiary islands, places to send inmates. The idea was very simple. The most dangerous men did not have to be in the city, in the world, in the town. It was preferable to send them out there far away. Murderers, scum, the trash, the worst. Those who had committed horrifying crimes, who had terrified society, who had disturbed order, should be sent there. What few knew is that in reality the central idea of Tomás Guardia was not to get rid of the extremely dangerous inmates. There were not that many, and they were not that frequent. But Tomás Guardia was trying to stay in power constantly and permanently. So, in reality, San Lucas Island became the place to send political enemies, opponents, journalists, writers, people who were opposed to him. It did not last many years. This fellow, Tomás Guardia, died relatively soon, some 8 or 9 years after San Lucas Island had been opened as a penitentiary facility. Tomás Guardia dies, but that does not mean the island disappears. Quite the opposite. The place continues. At the beginning, the conditions were terrible. A small landing was built with some dungeons that were built there of stone, with a small window at the top and a place through which they would throw the inmates. They literally threw the inmates. Beyond this, there were some huts where the inmates who were sent would be housed. The guard was generally military. The chances of escape very vague, very poor, despite the closeness to land. That was it. It was part of the horror of being there because from the shore of San Lucas Island you can see the mainland, you can see the peninsula. Therefore, it was dramatic. But they knew they would not make it, those who tried. Most of the time they did not get very far, although yes, there were escapes. But in that first period, the objective was not to send inmates, of course some were sent as well, but to finish off the political adversaries. When Tomás Guardia disappears, who dies relatively young, during the following years that became truly a prison, murderers, rapists, vagrants. It was an unbelievable mix of inmates and the conditions remained the same, which made the chances of survival inside this place very low. But we will see that later. As the years passed, and already at the beginning of the 20th century, some adaptations were made. Some improvements, let's call them that. A proper space for the command was built. A chapel would be built a little later. The famous pavilions of the disco were built, which was a site to house the inmates with a cistern, a water tank in the central part in the shape of a disc. Some modifications were made, and it was believed that that had improved things. As time passed, and by the 1950s, the penitentiary island ceased to be as such a prison and became an agricultural penitentiary colony where the inmates could be, in a certain way, free. There were animals. There were plots to sow. They were self-sustaining. Let's call it that. That was in 1958. However, despite this, the brutality inside the island was shameful. Shameful for a country that had officially eliminated the army since 1948, when the Costa Rican army was declared extinct. For a country that had declared itself openly pacifist, to have San Lucas Island and the conditions that existed there was terrible. The construction of the famous hachas was part of this project. It did not entirely mean improvements, but at least it was already a paradise compared to the original. By 1991, it was decided to close it completely as a prison. There is nothing there anymore, and later it became a biosphere reserve, a place where there are all kinds of birds, critters, turtles, and other things. But why has this island attracted so much attention from locals and outsiders? It draws attention because, like many other penitentiary islands, the conditions were extreme. However, when you see Alcatraz, the penitentiary island in the USA, that was practically a hotel compared to this island. Islas Marias in Mexico was not far behind either. The brutality was similar. But here there were so many factors that piled up. In 1963, a man wrote a book about this, José León Sánchez. The name of the book is The Island of Lonely Men, and it was a narration of his own experiences on the island and of the experiences of other inmates who told him. This opened the door for the world to know what was happening there, and obviously Costa Rica, ashamed of that, ended up closing it. But it would not be closed until the year 1991, much later. After this brief parenthesis or this introduction, let me tell you a little more. The island was originally considered a place for political enemies, and this led to there being no care toward the inmates. When an inmate arrived on the island, the first thing that was done was to break him, to shatter him. It was known that the inmates, regardless of whether they were criminals, politicians, enemies of the regime, as in the case of the 1920s, or whether they were criminals of the greatest violence or simply people who had been pointed at and framed, none of that mattered. They were taken there, and they were broken. To break a person, the first thing that was done was to put him in a sort of cell, in these dungeons that were near the port. As soon as arriving, they threw him in there. A group of men inside a confined space with barely a hole at the top. There was no ventilation to speak of. There was no sewage service. There was no toilet. There was no supply of anything. Those who fell there could have been in temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius. And then madness began in there, with the absolute humidity stuck to the body, the salt stuck to the body. The delirium of being locked up led to those tough, dangerous men gradually being broken. Killers would pass through there. But, obviously, there would also pass through there a guy who stole something, someone who killed, but who was not really a criminal, simply on one occasion, over some quarrel, over a grudge, and he ended up there. The food. For those who were in these first holding cells, let's call it, in this kind of dungeons, the food was very simple. At a certain time of day, a guard with a bucket would throw the food through this hole and then would throw in a pail of water. Whoever could eat would eat with his hand what had fallen on the floor mixed with the feces of those who were in there. And then the water, the same. You had to drink it however you could, lick it off the floor in the madness of being there for several days. Some would end up dead. Others would kill the one next to them in the most brutal ways, strangled, beaten, whatever. What they did not know is that the dead would remain there. The guards would do nothing to take him out until it was authorized to take all the inmates out. They would take the dead one out. This meant that in just a few hours the one who had died would begin to decompose, and after 3 days he would be an unbearable, pestilent mass. But that didn't matter. It really did not matter whether those inmates came out alive or not. What mattered was that when they came out, their will was so broken that they could not fight, that they would not be combative. Over there, inside, beyond where the other inmates were, those who had survived the first confinement, the conditions were similar, so they would never again have the strength to face the guards. 30 guards for 250 inmates. Sometimes even more. An uprising and finishing off the guards would be relatively easy. That is why it was necessary for them to break them in the worst way. They were not innocent people. Some, yes, obviously, yes. The political prisoner who fell there and at the same time fell in with a guy who had killed 7 or 8, or with the leader of a gang of murderers, was lost. But the one who had sent him to prison would come out perfectly clean. In the case of the dictatorship of the Tinoco brothers, between 1917 and 1919, this was perfect. Anyone who opposed could be sent to San Lucas Island and would never again come out of there alive. Who killed him? Who knows what he died of? Who knows? Did they order him killed? No, they sent him to prison. And that he did not endure is different. So it was very appropriate. But other tremendous things are told as well, you know? Once the first inmates arrived and were thrown in there, if any of them was a pretty young man, that one in particular was highly coveted. The Island of Lonely Men. There were no women, as its name indicates. Therefore, acts of sodomy were frequent. And the fact that a youngster had arrived and could literally be traded among the inmates was something very much taken advantage of. So the one who arrived and fell there did have to go through that hole, through the famous dungeon at the entrance. But if he died, that one they did take out, and very quickly it is said. In the early times, the one who died there was quickly taken away, washed, dressed as a woman, and sold. Brutality in its highest expression. But the others, if someone died there he stayed. This meant that whole groups of inmates who arrived died. It was impossible to survive. Being next to a corpse after 3 days in 50-degree heat meant that very soon everyone would be intoxicated and sick and would end up dying in there. After which, the problem came. Getting the bodies out. For this, lime was thrown and other inmates were sent to remove the bodies. The bodies as such. There was a cemetery, a small graveyard in there, but the graveyard has only a few bodies. So, very likely, most of these bodies were thrown into the sea. The current that descends would carry them to the Pacific Ocean. The current that ascends would carry them to the upper part of the Gulf of Nicoya, where they would probably be devoured, either by caimans, sharks, whatever was there. In the graves, there are barely a dozen bodies. So, in reality, in a prison that was open for more than 100 years, that is not believable. There was also a second stage. If a group of inmates had managed to survive the first phase, they would have to walk along a causeway that was known as the Street of Bitterness. Yes, I know there are many streets of bitterness, but that is what this one was called, the Street of Bitterness. A small cobbled causeway that led from these first facilities toward the interior of the prison. In there, in the early days, that meant arriving and having a shackle put on. The first thing that was done to prevent the inmates from fleeing was to place a shackle on them. The shackle was nothing more than a clamp that squeezed the ankle, a kind of metal ring that was tightly fastened with a simple iron screw at ankle height. The chain would be about 3 meters and must have weighed about 15 to 20 kilos. This had to be carried all the time. It was not removed. The inmates could go to a part of the island to cut vegetation to prepare pastures, since there would also be on this same place breeding pens where cattle-birds' deer were kept, which were sent to the mainland, and which served to pay the costs of the island, not for feeding the inmates. No, sir, it was to pay the costs. All the time, the inmate had to carry the chain. The aim was that if he tried to jump into the sea with the chain, he would probably die. He could not kick, he could not swim, he would drown. But the result of this was terrible. In the heat, without a proper hygiene, without being able to bathe, without being able to take that off, in a short time they would develop everything from gangrene, infections, anything. They would end up losing the foot, and this was a death sentence in the place. The medical dispensary would be built not until well into the 1930s, so before this the inmate was attended wherever possible. Once the workday was over, the inmates were taken back to the places of nighttime lodging where they were chained up. There were no individual cells as such. No beds, no bars, none of that. The inmate was simply hooked to a post, to a wall, wherever, and slept on the floor, in such a way that the will was being broken, and then came the food. The food was precarious in every sense: lack of water, lack of food, lack of vitamins, lack of fresh fruit, led to there being epidemics practically all the time. There were epidemics. In some cases, and according to accounts toward the end of the 19th century, around 1890, there were several epidemics that decimated the penitentiary population. Up to 60% of the inmates died. Where are the bodies? Good question. It is known that this happened from the testimonies of some inmates who were later released, but not because there are records. That is interesting. Many of the records that exist are from the testimonies of survivors or even from the guards themselves, but from those early years, obviously it was in no one's interest that there be records. What happened there, stayed there. Who had entered alive and who had not entered alive, who had come out alive, was a matter that did not matter, and obviously as the years went by it was in no one's interest that it be known. When Tomas Guardia dies and a new president comes in, he prefers to keep silent. When this happens in the 1920s with the Tinocos, the same. Better that it not be known. And so on. Records would be kept later, in the 1950s, when that had already become something different. But in those early years, from 1873 until well into the 1920s, inside there, life and death had no importance. The worst of the criminals could be tied up next to a man who had done nothing. When mealtime came, the worst of the criminals would obviously eat that other fellow's food, and would also use him for his low instincts. There was all that, but there were also ways to end it. Terrible things are told, for example. Those who tried to kill themselves had no way to. There was nothing with which. You were not given a tool. You ate with your hand, like that. The guard would throw something on the floor and you would pick it up and eat it. You could drink a little water from somewhere, from some bucket that might be there, from some container, but you had no implement, there was nothing you could keep, there was nothing with which you could take your life. Of course, someone might have tried to jump into the sea. Depending on the area, you could fall on the rocks, fracture yourself and stay there until you died, or drown from the tide on the other side. Jumping into the sea would mean drowning, and then your body being dragged away. It was a way out, but those who did not have the courage for that could ask the favor that someone kill them. The desperation was such that this could be asked. In there were guys who could kill you in the most varied ways, in exchange for whatever you had, whether cigarettes, for serving him for unbridled carnal instincts. The fact is that after this, he could squeeze your neck until killing you, and then the trouble and the pain of being locked up there was over. Are there proofs of this? Only testimonies. The fact is that the prison itself, even as time passed, would not improve. When in the 1930s the circular or disc pavilion was built, the conditions did not change. The inmates' lodgings were this kind of long barracks, with barely 3 vents on each side and a single door inside. In a small space, relatively, up to 70 or 80 individuals could fit. At dusk, when the door was closed and all remained inside, the temperature reached extraordinary levels, the absolute confinement. There were no toilets, there were no beds, there was no kind of partition between one and another. And although by the 1930s that business of shackles had gone out of fashion, what was a fact is that they were locked in there, and at nightfall there was no electricity, there was no lighting, there was nothing. What happened in there, stayed there. There were those who were already known to be part of a group and therefore had a function. There was the enforcer, there was the leader, like the caballon, former criminal who had been taken there. He would arrive later. But in the 1930s there were these gangs in there who administered all kinds of things, who had control of sex. They controlled the newcomers, and they could be sold. They could even be dressed as women. And, of course, the one who did not accept was lost because they would keep using him the same way and would end up killing him. Fever, typhoid, malaria were a common situation in this place. The one who refused and made trouble could also be sent to a new punishment. When the disco was built, this module with the pavilions around it in circular form, like a kind of panopticon, when this was done they realized it was a mistake. It had been built to store water. The water that fell on the roofs would come by means of a series of gutters to this tank that would serve to store water. But it did not work. To begin with, the place is very dry. When it rained, the tank was empty, it had cracked and it leaked quickly. But it had a plus. The place could serve as a torture cell. A single hole, similar to the famous dungeons at the entrance, except much hotter. The one who was thrown in there could spend several days there. Barely. They would throw him something when someone remembered. The screams, the horror, the fact of being in a closed place whose cover is exposed to the sun could reach temperatures of 60 degrees, enough to dehydrate a person in just a few hours. Only a few survived. And of course, they survived if the head of the guard so wished. If the chief ordered that no water be put, no water would be put, and the inmate would die in 2 days. If the chief ordered that it be a punishment but not death, water would be thrown and at some point food. But there were no services. There was no way to evacuate waste. And of course, when it rained and water fell, the waste began to float around the river that was in there, in such a way that even when there was a lot of water, its quality was disgusting. And in a few hours, when it stopped raining, the water had leaked again. It was not the only thing there was. The beatings, the constant abuses, the injuries were frequent. It was a place where the will to live is lost when one arrives and someone is lost. The inmates who were sent were said to be for life, that they would never come out again. And yet they would also suddenly send a youngster for having stolen something with the full intention. Not because he was a lifer, it was because they needed fresh meat, as they were called, and as soon as they arrived they were dedicated to that. But there were also animals, so the perversions that were practiced in this place were enormous. The fact of locking these highly dangerous subjects in an isolated place, practically without control during the nights, was a sentence for the weak. That did not mean that the weak had not committed crimes in every case. In some cases they were definitely innocent, but there they met their end. The horror that was lived in this place is what leads me to think whether it is right to go there and take a selfie with shorts and flip-flops, when in this very site where the woman with the boots is drawn, someone raped his companion, sexually abused his companion, and then killed him. The place does not lend itself to being pretty to go in a colorful swimsuit. An American tourist taking a selfie. It is a place that should already be on the ground because it is the memory of atrocities that were committed there. Even in the 1950s, after Costa Rica had leapt to world fame for having abolished the army and having been an example of a pacifist country, in this place people were still being killed and there were still abuses. José León Sánchez tells this in 1950, when he was accused of a robbery and was named the Beast of the Basilica, or the Monster of the Basilica for having gone to steal objects of value from a basilica. In the act, someone had died. In reality, José León was not guilty. He did not do the robbery. It had been a relative who pointed him out. That gives you an idea of how many people who had not committed any crime ended up there. And of course, there were also major criminals and extremely dangerous subjects, all mixed. That led to this place being considered the gate of hell. Although some considered that the gate of hell was the entrance, and here inside was hell itself. Years later. These same barracks where today the female and male tourists take photos and smile and make absurd gestures. In this place the inmates painted these things. It was the reflection of their fear, of their desires, of their contempt for the life of others, of the violence one cannot begin to imagine. When one sees these images of brutal extreme sexuality, we are not seeing something nice. The fact of seeing a drawing that looks like the soccer player Pelé does not mean that it was fun to be there. No, none of that. It was what people saw, what they believed, what they thought, what they dreamed. Inmates who slept there, one on top of another, waiting to see at what moment someone abused them, at what moment someone killed them. It is not a pleasant place, it is clear to me, when it closes. Moreover, there is not much information, despite the fact that it was in the 1990s. You would expect there to be information, files, archives. There are not. Important human rights researchers have requested access to the reports. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which has its headquarters in Costa Rica, has requested access to the official reports, to the reality of what happened there. The University of Costa Rica has done archaeological surveys everywhere, but they do not find the data. It catches my attention because obviously in a country with a history of pacifism, that there was this colony with such humiliations was incredible. Is there certainty that this occurred? Yes. The guards themselves who have survived, probably the last ones in recent times, told this. They told how at a certain hour the guards, after finishing the last inspection at 9 at night, would get away from there. They did not want to know anything about it, because whoever was nearby would hear what happened inside. It was preferable the next day to simply report a missing inmate. He was not really missing. They had killed him during the night, and his own companions at dawn when the door was opened would have dragged him and thrown him into the sea, or would have taken him into the vegetation over there, and there he remained. In such a way that there were no culprits, there were no accusations. Of course, if someone hit a policeman or one of the guards, he would end up in the disco, or before the disco existed, he would end up in some small cells that were at the water's edge, where, when the tide came in, the inmate was left with water up to here, if he was lucky, because sometimes the tide rose a little more and killed him. There was also the cage. The cage was established well into the 1950s, that is why I tell you it surprises me. The cage was a cage, a steel grill where they put an inmate, probably the most dangerous, the ugliest, the one who had committed the worst horrors. And when visitors arrived, because by the 1950s there were already visitors, they could see him. Today, we would take a selfie with the inmate. It is the equivalent of what they are doing now. They would go take a selfie with the inmate. That was what there was there. How many other things happened? I do not know. Did guards die? Yes, there were guards killed. Many. It was easy, you got distracted, and the inmate who was closest to you with the chain would cut off your head. He would wrap the chain around you until he finished strangling you and finally would rip you away. He had nothing to lose, and when asked what happened, no one saw anything. So the guards were not safe either. Perhaps because of this it was. According to what is said, in the 1930s a terrible act was ordered. Apparently, in the 1930s, a group of inmates had killed one of the guards in one of the pavilions, in the back part of these, which were like 2 levels. One of those inmates had murdered a guard. Next, he had run and gone into the cell along with other inmates who were there, and had closed the door, had barred it. The captain ordered a fire set below. They had locked themselves up on the upper part. So on the lower part, where they stored different things, there they placed zacate, that is, dry grass, wood, branches, whatever, and they set it on fire. They burned them all. All who were upstairs died, asphyxiated, burned, whatever. The next day they cleaned the place, the bodies were thrown over there, and things went on. So yes, there was extreme violence in all directions. Did they kill the nurse to paint the picture? No, but if there had been a nurse, they surely would have killed her. They were not good people. Many of those who were in there were not good people. They were despicable beings in many senses, capable of killing, of abusing, of making the worst human instincts arise, and focus them on the one of lesser strength, on the one who could not defend himself. As the years went by, that must have left an impregnated charge in this place. Those who have visited the site claim that it can still be felt. And let me tell you something. The places that are visited today, These places where the paintings are, like those of the women that I have shown you, are not the places where the worst atrocities were committed. These were the calm places. These were the places that were opened already well into the 1935s. Yes, these were not the worst. And even so, the simple fact of entering there permeates a strange, energetic vibe, a feeling of loneliness, of abandonment, of anger. I do not know how you can take a selfie with a colorful swimsuit next to one of these images. What do you think? Of course, it is a historic site, but there should be some respect. In Mexico, for example, we have the Black Palace of Lecumberri, one of the worst prisons on record. And it was not this. It was a harsh, violent, cruel prison. When it was closed, it was going to be demolished. It was simply going to be swept away completely. It was decided to preserve it because it was a historical monument in terms of the building. But it was given a meaning. It was turned into the historical archive, the National General Archive, where the files of those who lived there, who suffered there, are archived. San Lucas Island begs for something different, because inside there the vileness, the cruelty, the pain, the fear remained impregnated. Paranormal phenomena. There must be some. There must be, but they are not very believable either. The testimonies and the investigations of paranormal tourism are just as offensive. These groups that are formed with a flashlight, with a signal finder, and who go around saying, "If you are here, give us a sign." It makes no sense for them to do that, but those who have been there for years have lived horrible things. Some of the testimonies we have been able to find from inmates who were there late in the 1960s and 1970s before it was closed in 91 claimed that the place not only had fear in this site. Not only did you have the fear of what the one next to you would do to you, but of what the one you no longer see would do to you, the beast that growls next to you, and there is no one. When there was already electricity, you could already see. Suddenly you felt that there was someone next to you. You threw yourself on the floor. As always, there were no beds. You did not need to cover yourself. Simply look for a way for it not to be so terrible to be there for the insects, not to climb on you. And then suddenly in the middle of the night you felt this strange cold that came over you, in a place with an ambient temperature of 40 degrees. Suddenly you felt a frightful cold and something that is next to you, and you realize that there is no one next to you but something stayed there. And then the voices. For years, the inmates who returned from being in the field work when it was already an agricultural colony, and who returned either to Las Hachas, I will tell you about that now, or returned to the disco area. If, for some reason, it became night in the middle of the thicket, they were accompanied all the time. Sometimes the guards had already gone. It didn't matter. Go as you can, but no one is at night there because in these places suddenly someone speaks to you. They are talking to you, but there is no one. Or suddenly someone is pulling at you. You clearly feel how they are pulling at your clothes and there is no one next to you. But when you get to the area where the different settlements are, and then it is night. In the midst of the solitude of these dark places, the sounds of the animals suddenly stop completely. There is no animal sound for some reason. All the cicadas, the monkeys, the different bats that are in this site keep silent, and that is when that scream is heard, a deep, long lament, right next to you. When there is no one in this site, when they are not there. Some would lose their mind. Some would lose their mind. It is said that some inmates, after being locked in the famous slab, feeling the presence of these things next to them, went mad. The slab was a special place. It was a punishment cell. It was like buried, 3 small doors for 3 small cells. Totally closed everything. There is no sun. There is no ventilation. There is no sewage. There is no toilet. There is nothing. The temperature can rise incredibly. You are in there, the heat, the sweat. And suddenly, so that you do not get sick, someone opens a little hatch that is above and throws handfuls of lime that immediately begin to react with your own organic matter, with your urine, your excrement, the remains of the food, generating an unusual heat, which is why it was called the slab. And it had its option, You could go to the slab or to the boat. The boat was that you went to unload the boats that arrived. The slab was your punishment. But as time went by, the slab was not only the slab and its punishment, but also what was there. The fact that being there, suddenly you felt how something pressed you against the wall, as if there were a person pressing you, as something that lifts you, as something that strangles you, that pulls you, that rips you. But only you are there. There is nowhere another person could be. You cannot even lie down. 1 out of every 10 came out alive, the others died in there. Septicemias, intoxication, dehydration, insect bites, and, of course, outside there was the other thing. The outside, walking in the vegetation. What do you want to escape for? You will not get very far. If you try to cross toward the eastern zone, where there were a series of small bays, you would end up torn to pieces, because in this site there is Hierba Santa everywhere. And Hierba Santa is incredibly urticant. It causes everything from skin irritation to very high fevers. There are critters, there are spiders, there are plants everywhere that can take your life in a little while. How many were left there? Good question. As much as we have asked, we have not found a single datum that shows us how many inmates were really there. There is a precarious historical record that shows that in 1 year 18 inmates died, in another year 3 died. But even the person who discovered this in an archaeological investigation insists that that is not possible. Because of the conditions on the island, and because of the testimonies that exist, it is not possible. But they left a mark of pain, of anguish, of fear, all the conditions for this site to be a place with a dreadful paranormal charge. The buildings that are there today are recent. The old chapel was actually built in the 1930s of the last century. The command area as well, the dispensary likewise, the hachas. The hachas were built in the 50s, and the hachas were nothing more than some houses. They were the houses for the free inmates. As an agricultural community, there were people who could walk, come and go, and they had these spaces. They were the trusted prisoners, let's call them. Even so, roll call was taken at 9 at night. The guard would pass by and through a small opening in the door would shout, "Hacha!" That is, the face, stick your face out so I can see you, and he would write you down. That is why they were called the hachas. But there the conditions were no longer so terrible. And do not lose sight of the fact that this continued operating until 1991. Yes, as an agricultural colony, as whatever you want. But the agricultural colony began in 58. That is to say that well into the 20th century, this place was a place of death and destruction. Do you understand now? Why there are no records? Because no one wants it to be remembered. For many, the movie The Island of Lonely Men, a Mexican film from 1970-something, was a fantasy, something they had made up not knowing that it was based on the text by José León Sánchez, which was based on his own life. This man spent 30 years in that prison. If you have the chance to read that book, read it. It is hair-raising.